Welcome to Class 15 for Hebrew 1 and 2 for Bright Old Testament 500. Today we will be discussing the last two forms of the verb in the Qal stem, the infinitive and the participle. So let's dive in. We will begin with the Qal absolute infinitive. The infinitive, as in English, is often started with the word to, as in to kill. It's absolute because this form of the infinitive stands alone, without prefixes or suffixes. As you might guess, there are two forms of the infinitive. The infinitive is actually a verbal noun, and since nouns can be in both the absolute and the construct state, the infinitive will do the same. So we begin here with the absolute strong verb, the absolute not being in the construct state, not having anything attached to it. You see the form here, Qal, with a kametz under the kof and a holam vav in between the second and third root letters. This will be the form, again, in the Qal stem in particular, of the Qal absolute infinitive, Qal. Remember, we have covered qatal, which is the perfect, and yiktol, which is the imperfect. Now we add Qal, which is the infinitive absolute. Most of the verbs in the Qal stem play nice in the infinitive absolute, with the exception being third hey verbs that will occasionally write the infinitive absolute defectively, dropping out the vav of the holam vav in between the second and third letters. Occasionally the hey will drop completely, leaving only the holam vav at the end of the word, making it appear as though this is a two-letter stem with a 3ms object ending. However, you will need to remember that this is actually a third hey verb in the infinitive absolute. Biconsonantal verbs will always have holam vav in the infinitive absolute. Occasionally, the vav will drop out, leaving only holam, writing the infinitive absolute defectively. Regardless of what the vowel is in the verbal root, you will always have holam vav. This is somewhat easy to remember because the holam vav, even in words that have a holam vav, such as bow, will only have the holam vav in the imperfect, which has prefixes and suffixes, or in the infinitive, which we have here, making it easily differentiated from other forms of the Qal verb. All Hebrew infinitives in all stems are used in several different ways. They might be used for emphasis, translated as certainly or as surely before a typical verb. They might be used as an imperative, observe the Sabbath day, even though shamor is not actually an imperative. They might be explanatory, explaining what exactly is meant by a previous verb, or they may even be used verbally, used in place of a verb for whatever reason. The second type of infinitive is the infinitive construct. In the Qal, the verb will undergo propretonic vowel reduction, dropping the kametz under the kof to a vocal schwa, and dropping the vav of the holam vav so that only the holam remains between the two letters. This is called the construct form because it can take prefixes and suffixes and be used in the construct with the following noun. The form of the strong verb and most weak verbs in the infinitive construct is actually the same as the imperative to ms from the yiktol, where the yod has been dropped and you're left with qal, which, as you saw in the previous slide, is the form of the Qal infinitive construct. However, in many of the weak verbs, there is a clear difference between the infinitive construct and the imperative. Some weak verbs do not have a typical form of the infinitive construct. I've noted three here. Bana, or all third hey verbs, will have benot, where a holam vav appears, the preformative letter is a hirik, and a tav appears at the end. A one nun verb will maintain the nun in most forms, still putting the holam between the second and third letters, although if it is a guttural, there will be a furtive patak under the final root letter. However, in some cases, the nun drops completely, leaving a patak and a patak, two short vowels, underneath the first two root letters, and adding a tav at the end of the word. This is very similar to the imperative, with the exception of the tav at the end. In the one yod verbs, we also have that same pattern of two short vowels, where the yod has dropped off of the beginning. and a tav is found at the end of the verb. These two look very similar to segolets, and indeed this is a segolet form, with the emphasis on the first syllable and two short vowels. The majority of other weak verbs and strong verbs will follow the typical pattern of qatol. The Qal Infinitive Construct can take both object and suffix endings. They're the same pronominal suffix, just translated differently depending on context. You will also note that the vowel underneath the kof is a short vowel because that is a silent schwa under the second root letter. This has to do, again, with the rules of schwa and the combination of vocal schwas. So this is a kametz hatuf, a short O underneath the first root letter. You'll also notice that the connecting vowels change. Sometimes it is a hirik, sometimes it's a seirei, and sometimes, depending upon the actual suffix, it is a kametz. The infinitive construct in all stems is also able to take prepositions. These prepositional prefixes have various meanings and usages, and will have to be determined by context. The most common is to put lamed on front of the word amar, giving us lemor, meaning to say, which is used almost like a quotation mark in the Hebrew text. But you can also attach kaf and beit to the front of an infinitive. Infinitive constructs are negated not with all or lo, as in the imperative, imperfect, and perfect, but with bilti or labilti. These two negative words mean no or not, or in order not, indicating a negative purpose, and can often be a clue as to what form of the verb you are dealing with, since they will only be found with infinitive constructs. You can see here some specific uses of the infinitive construct, perhaps to give more explanation of what it is that is supposed to be known, or what is about to be done, in these two cases below. Here are a few more examples. You'll notice that all of these on both slides have prepositions attached. This is the most common usage of the infinitive construct, a preposition plus a verbal idea. Again, remembering that an infinitive is basically a verbal noun. On the other hand, a participle is a verbal adjective. As a verb, we have to indicate the stem and the voice, whether active or passive, and we typically translate it with ing. However, because this is also an adjective, we also have to indicate the gender and the number. We keep all of these things in mind when we're parsing. So we may have a Qal Active Participle 3ms as our parsing. The Qal Active Participle has the form ko-tail. So again, we have the perfect, qatal, the imperfect, yiktol, and the infinitive, qatol. Here we have ko-tail, where the holum, or the holum vav, is found in between the first and second root letters. Not in between the second and third root letters, as in the infinitive, but between the first and second. The second vowel becomes a seirei. Because the participle is an adjective, it must agree in person, gender, and number with the noun it is modifying. Thus, as you see here, the participle will take endings. We've seen these endings before, although we were not as specific with the feminine to differentiate between tav and kametz he, just noting that you might see both. You'll notice that the verb and vowel pattern is slightly different in the feminine. Instead of ko-tail, we have ko-telet and ko-tala as our possibilities. However, the rest of these are pretty similar to what we would expect. You need to memorize this chart, although again, we're basically only re-memorizing the specifics of the feminine. There are two unique forms of the Qal absolute participle. One, as we might expect, is the third he, that instead of bo-ne has either bo-ne, which keeps the he or may drop the he, or bo, and then there is no second vowel because the he has dropped. Thus we have bonim, bonot, bona, and bonia, all of which have dropped the he. In the second feminine here, the he has actually become a yod, which will occasionally happen, but not often. Thus, we need to keep in mind that this is an exception and a shortened form. The biconsonantal is also a shortened form, and instead of it being with a holum, we actually see here a comets, so that we have com, comim, coma, and comote. Remember that you have the comets instead of the holum. I've highlighted two of these because these are actually the same as the perfect, com and kama, 3ms and 3fs. Thus, context will have to tell you if we're dealing with a participle that ends in ing or simply a perfect verb. Because the Hebrew participle is an adjective, it will be used either predicatively or attributively. If it is attributive, it will agree with the noun it modifies in gender, number, and definiteness, meaning that if the noun has the article, so will the adjective. This should be easy to remember because the attributive is translated like an adjective with the article, all starting with A. So the first example here, the people who dwell, could actually be the dwelling people. And Yahweh your God is a consuming fire. Again, both are used as adjectives, consuming fire, dwelling people, and both have the article because the particular word that they are defining has the article, or lack the article because the defining word lacks the article. Attributive, like an adjective with the article. On the other hand, a predicative use does not agree with definiteness. It will still agree in gender and number, but it will not agree in definiteness. If the noun has the article, the participle will not have the article. Furthermore, when we translate it, we must provide a state of being verb. That's technically called a copula. So here we have the mountain was burning. Samuel was laying down. It's a state of being verb. Is, are, was, etc. You must provide the verb in the translation because there isn't one actually listed, but it is implied because it is the predicative use. Just as with the adjective, the participle has a third possible use, and that is the substantival use, where there is no noun being modified. Instead, the adjective stands in as both the adjective and the noun. So here, the one who keeps is the keeping one. We might see this in other cases. Instead of the holy men, we might simply see the holy in the masculine plural, meaning the holy men or the holy ones. Substantival, it carries the substance of both the verb and the noun, the participle and the noun. The participle explaining what the noun is doing, even though there is no noun present in the sentence. As with the infinitive, there is a second type of participle, the passive participle. The passive form is Qal. This looks very similar to the infinitive absolute, except that was Qal. Instead, this is Qal. Anytime you see a U-class vowel in between the second and third root letters, you almost always have a passive participle. It may sometimes be written defectively as a kibbutz instead of a shurik, but again, you still have that shurik or U-class vowel in between the second and third letters. You'll notice that the active participle was kotail. This doesn't look anything like that, looking far more similar to the infinitive absolute. But again, this is a type of participle, not a type of infinitive. As with the active participle, the passive participle will also take noun and adjective endings, plural and singular. The nice thing here, though, is that we do not have that first unusual form of the feminine noun. We only have the second form, the comets he, making this far more recognizable as a feminine singular. The Qal passive participle is consistent in all forms of the verb except for the third he verbs. Third he's will drop the he and become a yod, and will maintain the shurik of the passive participle. The yod differentiates the form of the passive participle that might be confused with Qal perfects, so that we know that we don't have banu, instead we have banui, where the yod at the end shows that this is not a 3CP. As I mentioned, when we parse participles, we need to include both the verbal and the adjectival differentiation in the parsings, so that we have both the verbal Qal stem, the active or passive participle, but then we must still identify whether or not it is masculine or feminine, singular or plural. All this information must be included in the parsing. Because participles are like adjectives, they may take the definite article, especially when they're agreeing with a noun that has a definite article. They may be found in the construct with the construct endings of the nouns and adjectives. They may also have prepositions, and they may be found with suffixes. However, none of these should really surprise us, as the form is fairly consistent. Well, we have covered the last two forms of the verb in the Qal verb stem. We have the infinitive and the participle. The infinitive is both absolute and construct, absolute having no prefixes or suffixes and having the form Qal, with a comma under the first root letter and a holum vav in between the second and third letter. The construct infinitive will take prefixes and suffixes, with a vocal schwa under the first root letter and a holum without the vav in between the second and third root letter. The participles are either active or passive, active participles being Qal, passive participles being Qal. Well, go back and review, use Quizlet as many times as you need, memorize your vocabulary, and I will see you in class.